Now on to the main event. Dr. Ted Schick is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Muhlenberg College. He is the author of 3 texts and numerous articles reprinted in multiple publications. His work appears in several volumes of Open Court's Philosophy and Popular Culture series, and Ted has also written articles for Free Inquiry and Skeptical Inquirer, and is listed in Warren Allen Smith's, and I love this title, Who's Who in Hell? And he is also a member of Lehigh Valley Humanists. Please welcome Ted Schick.
Well, thanks, Trish. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be with the Lehigh Valley Humanists. So I was thinking back to actually the first time that I was invited to speak to you guys, and that's Joe Fox invited me. And this is when you were meeting in a coffee house in downtown Bethlehem. So I don't know if there's anybody from back in those days, but that was a while ago. But Trish was kind enough to invite me to speak today. And we discussed the topic and came up with the topic of abortion. So that's what I hope to talk about today. And what I hope to show is that properly understood, the abortion controversy is really not a moral disagreement, it's a metaphysical one. So I thought that maybe I could begin by recounting a story that was making the rounds back in the 1970s when Roe versus Wade was decided. Well, it seems that 3 men of the cloth, a Catholic priest, a Protestant minister, and a Jewish rabbi walk into a bar. And the bartender goes up to him and says, I'm glad that I've got you all here because, you know, there's a question that's been bothering me. When does life begin? And of course, the Roman Catholic priest says, well, life begins at conception. And the Protestant minister says, no, life begins at birth. And the Jewish rabbi says, no, life begins when the kids have gone off to college and the dog has died. But what I want to point out today is that the question, when does life begin, is not the question to ask when you're considering the abortion controversy. The real important question is, when does personhood begin? But before we get into that topic, I guess it's worthwhile taking a little look at moral disagreements. So moral disagreements arise when people disagree about what moral principle we should follow. So for example, 2 fundamental moral principles are utilitarianism, which says that what makes an action right is that it maximizes happiness, everyone considered, and Kantianism, which says that an action is right if it respects individual rights. Now suppose that you were a Polish resistance fighter in Warsaw during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. So the Polish resistance was trying to oust the Nazis from Poland. And in their pushback, what the Nazis did is they strapped some innocent civilians on the outside of their tanks. Essentially, they made them human shields. So now suppose that you're a lucky or unlucky Polish resistance fighter and you have a bazooka. So you've got a moral dilemma. Do you aim that bazooka at the tank and fire, in which case you'll certainly kill the innocent civilian and violate the Kantian principle that you should not kill innocent people? Or do you not fire, realizing that, you know, if you do fire, it might not work anyway, but you certainly will kill the innocent person? Well, this is a real moral disagreement because we have 2 principles that are butting heads, the principle of Kantianism and the principle of utilitarianism. But it's important to realize that all moral judgments, disagreements about moral judgments, are not about which principle should be operative. And to understand that, I think we need to take a look at the nature of moral judgment. So this is the logic of a moral judgment. To arrive at a moral judgment, you do have to appeal to a moral principle. But appealing to a moral principle isn't enough. A moral principle like action is right if it maximizes happiness is not going to tell you what to do in particular situations. What you need is you need to know something about the particular situation that you're in. So you need some factual information as well. So to arrive at a moral judgment, you need not only a moral principle, but you need a factual claim. And so if people make different moral judgments, it doesn't necessarily follow that they hold different moral principles. It may be that they disagree about the facts of the case. Well, for example, take the slavery controversy. So the moral principle that would be applicable here would be, of course, equals should be treated equally. But to arrive at the conclusion that slavery is wrong, we have to say that slaves are equal in all the morally relevant respects. But it's important to realize that slavers and abolitionists don't disagree about the moral principle involved. No slaver would ever deny that equals should be treated equally. What they deny is that slaves are equal. So the disagreement between the slaver and the abolitionist is not about the morality of the situation, but the facts of the case. In other words, their disagreement is, they don't disagree about the nature of morality, they disagree about the nature of reality, about the nature of the slaves. Well, consider the abortion controversy. That argument is often presented this way. Well, murder is wrong, abortion is murder, therefore abortion is wrong. And just as no slaver would deny that equals should be treated equally, no pro-choice person would deny that murder is wrong. What they deny is that abortion is murder. So to see how they can arrive at that sort of conclusion, it's important to become a little bit more clear about just what murder involves. So from a moral point of view, murder is the intentional, unjustified killing of a person. So if you kill a chicken, it's not an act of murder because a chicken is not a person. If you kill somebody in self-defense, that's not murder either because it's justified. And if you kill somebody accidentally, that's not murder because it's not intentional. All three of these things have to be present in order for something to be considered murder. Pro-choice people believe that fetuses are not persons, and so therefore abortion is not murder. So the question then becomes, well, what is it that makes something a person? Well, a person from a moral point of view is something that has full moral status, including a right to life. So the question arises, well, why do we have full moral status and cows and pigs and chickens don't? Is it something about our physiology that gives us our special moral status? Is it, well, those cows, they've got 4 stomachs. We only have 1. Obviously, we're morally superior. We can eat them. Or do we want to say, chickens, they're covered with feathers. We've got hair. Everybody knows that hair is better than feathers. We can eat them. Or those pigs, they got cloven hooves. Opposable thumbs are much superior to cloven hooves, so we can eat them. Well, it's important to realize it's nothing about our physiology. It's nothing about our biology that gives us our special moral status. It's what we can do with that biology. It's the functions that we can perform. So what are the functions that persons can perform that non-persons can't? Well, there are things like being conscious, being self-conscious, being able to reason, being able to communicate, being able to engage in self-motivated activity. And so it's important to realize that being a person is a different concept from being a biological human being. And one way to get at that is to see whether or not being a biological human being is either necessary or sufficient for being a person. Well, let's consider the necessary condition first. Is being a biological human being a necessary condition for being a person? In other words, is it possible for something to be a person and not be a biological human being? Well, if it is, then being a biological human being is not necessary for being a person. And although there may not be many people here tonight that believe in non-biological persons, I imagine that there's a number of people that you know who believe that there is at least one person that's not a biological human being. Who would that be?
Corporations.
Pardon? Pardon?
Corporations.
Corporations. Well, corporations are legal persons, not moral persons.
Jesus.
God. God is a person. As Richard Swinburne said, that God is a person, yet one without a body, seems to be the most elementary claim of theism. God doesn't have a biological body, and yet he's a person. Why? Because he has the sort of features that persons have. He's conscious, self-conscious, can reason, can communicate, can engage in self-motivated activity, supposedly, right? And of course, this is a view that is not held by Oxford philosophers like Richard Swinburne, but here is the Christian Apologetic Research Ministry. Well, let me see if I can read this to you. So we would first have to define what person means before we can determine if God is a person. So some people think that a person must have a body of flesh and bones. But strictly speaking, personhood does not necessitate that. Indeed, personhood is defined as having a will, self-awareness, emotions, being able to recognize others, speaking, and so forth, the sorts of criteria that we looked at earlier. Therefore, angels would be persons, since they have wills, speak, and so forth. God would be a person too. Of course, in the Christian doctrine, God is comprised of three persons. And of course, that's why the Muslims claim that the Christianity is really not a monotheistic religion, because the Christian God is three persons in one. Well, anyway, so we may not be the only persons on the planet. So interestingly enough, it turns out that India's Ministry of Environment and Forests has declared that dolphins are non-human persons. Why? Because dolphins can perform the same sorts of functions that we talk about persons being able to perform. As they say here, whereas cetaceans in general are highly intelligent and sensitive, and various scientists who have researched dolphin behavior have suggested that the unusually high intelligence as compared to other animals means that dolphins should be seen as non-human persons, and as such should have their own specific rights, and it's morally unacceptable to keep them captive for entertainment purposes. And there may be a whole other group of persons walking the planet in the not too distant future, namely robots. So you may know the robot Sophia was actually granted legal personhood. It was granted citizenship by Saudi Arabia in 2017. So Tesla is going to be mass producing humanoid robots next year. I think you can buy one for like $10,000. But there's going to be a bunch of them around. And if they can be conscious, self-conscious, if they can reason, if they can communicate, if they can engage in self-motivated activity, they have all the criteria necessary for personhood. In that case, we're going to have to grant them the same sorts of rights we grant each other. So this is one of the problems with the AI revolution that people like Musk and Stephen Hawking and so forth are worried about. So being a biological human being is not necessary for being a person. The question then becomes, is it sufficient? In other words, is it possible for some biological person or some biological human being not to be a person? Anybody think? Anybody have any ideas on that question? Can you think of a biological human being that's not a person?
Besides Trump?
Well,
Yeah.
well, there is, historically, people who are, severely developmentally disabled, who cannot do a lot of those things.
Right.
There were efforts to eugenics and things like that.
Right, so there's that. But actually, all 50 states in America have adopted the whole brain criterion of death. So you can have a living, breathing human being on your hands, but if their brain is dead, there's considered to be no person present, so you can remove life support. And most neurophysiologists would argue that, in fact, you could cease to be a person long before your whole brain stops working. Because the part of the brain that's responsible for the functions that we're talking about, consciousness, self-consciousness, reasoning, communication, self-motivated activity, that's the cortex. And if your cortex is dead, then you're never going to regain consciousness. Those people are said to be in a permanent vegetative state. They're not totally brain dead, it's just that the cortex is dead, so they can't do any of the sorts of things associated with consciousness. So as David Perry writes in Ethics and Personhood, if what really matters is the permanent loss of consciousness, then in theory we could declare persons dead even if they were not whole brain dead. This view is consistent with the idea, which I find compelling, that a person's life is coextensive with his or her capacity for experience and thought. By this definition, human beings in permanent comas and persistent vegetative states would be dead persons. Now, it turns out that there are somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 people in permanent vegetative states in various hospitals and nursing homes. And it costs from $150,000 to $200,000 a year to keep those biological human beings alive. Now, if those diagnoses are correct, there's no chance that they're ever going to regain consciousness. So that's $1 billion to $7 billion that's being spent on people who have no chance of getting better, which of course obviously could be better spent on people that do have a chance to get better. So something to think about as our medical technology becomes more sophisticated. Well, so what does this tell us about fetuses then? So fetuses are biological human beings, but as we've seen, being a biological human being is neither necessary nor sufficient for being a person. And so as Marianne Warren claims, all we need to claim to demonstrate that a fetus is not a person is that any being which satisfies none of 1 through 5, and again, that's consciousness, self-consciousness, reasoning, communication, self-motivated activity, is certainly not a person. I consider this claim so obvious that I think anyone who denied it and claimed that a being which satisfied none of 1 through 5 was a person all the same would thereby demonstrate that he had no notion at all of what a person is, perhaps because he confused the concept of a person with that of genetic humanity. So philosophical analysis of personhood reveals that fetuses can't be considered to be persons. Well, that's the philosophical side. What do the scientists say? Well, you may remember the documentary film Silent Screen that was making the rounds in the 1980s. So Silent Scream was a moving ultrasound of a fetus, it was a 12-week-old fetus being aborted. And as the abortion instrument was stuck into the womb, the baby opened its mouth. And so the person that made this film claimed that the baby realized it was about to be aborted, and so it gave out a silent scream. That was the claim. Well, Patricia Jaworski decided to check that out because it didn't jibe with what she understood about the nature of biological and neural development. And so she went around to a number of major neurophysiologists in the country and asked them, is it true that a 12-week-old fetus can have any sort of conscious experience? And of course, what she found was that the answer is no. So for example, as Dominic Purpura, dean of the Albert Einstein School of Medicine at the time, said, before the 28th week of development, the cortex lacks sufficient axons, dendrites, and synapses to sustain the processes of thought, feeling, and awareness necessary for personhood. So the neurons are in the brain at the time, but they're not hooked up. So they're not sending signals to one another, so it's impossible biologically for the fetus to feel pain before the neurons get hooked up, and that doesn't happen until the 28th week. So he goes on to say, we're putting the boundary condition, a limit, the minimal time for personhood to begin, Purpura says. It's not 3 months, it's not 2 months, it's 7 months. And the Journal of the American Medical Association did a multidisciplinary review of the evidence, and they reached the same sort of conclusion. A fetus is not capable of experiencing pain until 28 to 30 weeks after conception, when the nerves that carry painful stimuli to the brain have developed. Before that, the fetal reaction to noxious stimuli is a reflex that does not involve consciousness. So not until the 28th week can a fetus be considered to be conscious. So it turns out that 90% of all abortions are performed in the first trimester, 99% are performed by the end of the second semester. So no person has been killed in those abortions, according to the scientists. Well, what does the Bible have to say about fetuses? Well, interestingly enough, the Bible also says that fetuses are not persons. There's only one part of the Bible that deals with anything like an abortion. It's Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 through 25. And what it describes is a fight between two men. So two men are fighting. A pregnant woman tries to break up the fight. And one of the men hits the pregnant woman and causes her to miscarry. And so the question is, all right, so what's the penalty? Right? According to Exodus chapter 21, if the fetus miscarries and nothing happens to the woman, then you pay a fine. But if any harm comes to the woman, then the lex talionis applies, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe, life for life. The equation is you take a life, even accidentally, you pay for it with your life. You kill a fetus, you pay a fine. What's the Bible telling us? The Bible is telling us that the fetus is not considered to be a person. And this is how the Jews have understood this, from the beginning. As Fred Rosner says, an unborn fetus in Jewish law is not considered a person until it's been born. The fetus is regarded as part of the mother's body and not a separate being until it begins to egress from the womb during parturition. So it looks like the philosophers, the scientists, and the biblical scholars are agreed that a fetus is not a person. But let's take a closer look at the relationship between the Bible and morality. So people who look to the Bible for moral guidance hold what's often described as the divine command theory. And of course, according to the divine command theory, God is the source and ground of morality. He's the author of the moral law. So actually, I had my first exposure to the divine command theory when I was 10 years old at Christmas Eve dinner. So I was sitting at the adults' table for the first time at Christmas Eve dinner, and the dinner is going on. And Aunt Dorothy says, "Did you hear the one about Moses and the tablets?" And everybody looked at me. And I didn't understand why they looked at me. And I found out, well, Dorothy was known for her risque stories. And I think they were afraid that, her ribald tales were going to be too much for my tender ears. But Dorothy went ahead anyway. And she said, well, Moses goes up to the mountains, brings the tablets back down, and of course, everybody gathers around. They say, what did he say? What did he say? And Moses says, well, I got some good news, and I got some bad news. All right, well, give us the good news. Well, the good news is he kept the commandments down to 10. Now, if any of you were raised in the Jewish tradition, you know that he was a little bit off. So how many commandments do the Jews think are in the Old Testament? 613, that's right. So a little bit more than 10, right? Okay, what's the bad news? Well, the bad news is he kept the one about adultery in there. So that's as bad as it got. But what's interesting about this story is that it exactly portrays the theological logic of the divine command theory. According to the divine command theory, adultery was neither right nor wrong prior to or independently of God saying it was right or wrong. And if he didn't say it was wrong, it's okay. That's theological logic. And of course, this has been used a lot of times, especially in the case of slavery. Right, so here's Jefferson Davis on slavery. Slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It's sanctioned in the Bible in both testaments from Genesis to Revelation. It's existed in all ages, has been found among people of the highest civilization, and in nations of the highest proficiency in the arts. Jefferson Davis thought these Northerners were taking away his God-given right to own slaves. Why does he have a God-given right? Because God never said it was wrong. Here is Reverend Alexander Campbell laying out the theological logic of Jefferson Davis's position. There is not one verse in the Bible inhibiting slavery, but many regulating it. It is not, then, we conclude, immoral. So what does the Bible have to say about abortion? Nothing. There's nothing in the Old Testament in which God is forbidding abortion. There is nothing in the New Testament for which God is forbidding abortion. So by the theological logic of the divine command theory, then, abortion is permissible. Because God nowhere said that it was wrong. Well, what about the sixth commandment? Right? Thou shalt not kill. Doesn't that apply to the abortion controversy? Well, it turns out that the Bible nowhere says thou shalt not kill. The Bible says thou shalt not murder. The notion thou shalt not kill was actually a mistranslation caused by Martin Luther himself. But Bible scholars know that the Bible does not say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. And so if the fetus is not a person, as it seems it's not, because the penalty for killing a fetus is not death, then feticide cannot be considered to be an act of murder. Well, what about the soul? How does that figure into theological thought about these sorts of things? Well, of course, scientists have no truck with the soul. As Don Hebb, great psychologist whose theory of memory is still accepted to this day, modern psychology, he says, takes completely for granted that behavior and neural function are perfectly correlated, that one is completely caused by another. There is no separate soul or life force to stick a finger into the brain now and then and make neurocells do what they would not do otherwise. So science has no truck with souls. But amazingly enough, the Bible has no truck with souls. The Bible gives us no reason to believe that there are such things as immortal souls that can exist independently of the body. And this is almost unanimously agreed upon by biblical scholars. It's not that, well, there's a couple people here believe it, or that the biblical scholars are evenly divided on it. It's something that's unanimously agreed to almost. Of course, nothing is unanimous, but this is the consensus, right? So there appears to be a rare unanimity among biblical scholars that the biblical picture of the person is non-dualist. Now, what that means is that if you're a dualist, you think there's two different types of substances in the world. So there's material substance on the one hand and immaterial substance like the soul on another hand. Well, the biblical picture of the person is non-dualist. It does not say that the person is composed of two separate substances, each of which can exist independently of the other. The biblical biblical picture of the person is monist, not dualist. So the Bible gives little or no support to the idea that a person is essentially a soul, or that the soul is separable from the body. So in Erdman's Bible Dictionary, we read, indeed, the salvation of the immortal soul has sometimes been a commonplace in preaching, but is fundamentally unbiblical. Biblical anthropology is not dualistic, but monistic. The human being consists of the integrated wholeness of body and soul, and the Bible never contemplates the disembodied existence of the soul in bliss. So if somebody taught you that when you die you go to heaven or to hell, that has nothing to do with the Bible, because the Bible does not say that. So why is there a consensus that there is no mortal soul? Well, the words that get translated soul are nephesh in Hebrew and sukkah in Greek, and they both mean a living, breathing creature. So according to the Bible, you're not alive until you take your first breath. And the second sort of reason is that if there were such a thing as a mortal soul, the main event of the Bible, namely Jesus' resurrection, and then the general resurrection at Judgment Day, would make no sense. The notion of an immortal soul contradicts the basic teachings of the Bible. Why is that? Well, consider. Here's Thatcher. He says, the resurrection and ascension of Christ seems clearly to exclude dualistic accounts of the human person. The death of Christ was a real and total death, not merely the death of his mortal body. The miracle of Jesus' resurrection is precisely that God raises Jesus from the dead, not that he raises Jesus' immortal body and reunites it with his immortal soul. What purpose, we may ask, does the resurrection of Jesus serve if Jesus was not really dead? And of course, people who believe that Jesus died and resurrected usually claim that he did because he had to atone for our sins. But if Jesus had an immortal soul, and that immortal soul didn't die, then there was no real sacrifice. And if there was no real sacrifice, there was no atonement. And if there's no atonement, then we're still living in sin. So the notion of a soul contradicts the basic sort of narrative that's going on in the Bible here. And then, of course, there's not only Jesus' resurrection, but there's the general resurrection on Judgment Day. Right? That's supposedly how we're going to get eternal life. Now, William Tyndale was the first person to translate the Bible into English. And 83% of the King James Version of the Bible comes from Tyndale's translation. And Tyndale knew full well that the Bible has no truck with such things as immortal souls. And he says, the reason that the Bible has no truck with immortal souls is because the promise of resurrection would make no sense. Here's how he puts it. And ye, in putting them, the departed souls, in heaven, hell, and purgatory, destroy the arguments wherewith Christ and Paul prove the resurrection. And again, if the souls be in heaven, tell me why they not be as good in the case as the angels be. And then what causes there of the resurrection? Then here you are, you're up in heaven, you got your harp, you got your cloud, you're jamming out with your buddies, right? And all of a sudden you have to go back down to earth to get resurrected? What's that about? No, the Bible never says anything about that. Your chance for eternal life is the same way that Jesus, supposedly got eternal life, by being resurrected. And of course, that's a bodily sort of thing. Well, one more quote here. So this is from Karl Barth, who you may or may not know, but he's generally considered to be the greatest theologian of the 20th century. And Pope Pius XII said that Karl Barth was the greatest theologian since St. Thomas Aquinas, which is an amazing thing for a Catholic pope to say about a Protestant theologian. But Barth was clear that the Bible said nothing about souls, and this is how he puts it. And now the Christian man looks forward. What's the meaning of the Christian hope in this life? A life after death, an event apart from death, a tiny soul which like a butterfly flutters away above the grave and is still preserved somewhere in order to live on immortally. That was how the heathen looked on life, on the life after death. But it is not the Christian hope. So if you think that when you die you're going to go to heaven, you're a heathen. And it's not me saying that. It's the greatest theologian since St. Thomas Aquinas. So more specifically, you're a Platonist. In other words, you're a follower of the philosopher Plato. Plato was a dualist. He thought there were such things as immortal souls. And it was when Platonism got mixed up with Christian theology and Augustine that this whole immortal soul thing came to be. But it comes from Plato. It doesn't come from the Bible. And I think there's one other piece of information that indicates that the people who claim that fetuses are persons from the moment of conception is something that they don't really accept. And I think we just have to consider the nature of pregnancies. So the number of pregnancies that result in miscarriage is somewhere around 60%. So 60% of all fertilized eggs spontaneously abort. So that means that the number of spontaneous abortions per year in America is about 6 million. Worldwide, that would be 230 million. So if these were really persons, this really would be a Holocaust of major proportions. Well, if those people who claim that believe that these fetuses are persons, why aren't they doing something to stop this Holocaust? In other words, where's the 5K for the zygotes? Right? We have a 5K for heart disease. We have a high 5K for lung disease. We have a 5K, for HIV. You would think that people would be raising money to see if we could bring down the number of fetuses that are spontaneously aborted. As Rob Lovering says, now if the natural epidemic were killing the same number of, say, standard adult human beings annually, we would at least be talking about, if not doing all that we could, to eliminate the epidemic. But I know of no one who has given any consideration to thwarting the epidemic of spontaneous abortions. So they can't really believe that these fetuses are persons from the moment of conception. If they did, they would be doing something about this. Well, so how did it come to be that the evangelicals, for example, believe that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception? Well, it turns out that in evangelical circles, that view is younger than the Happy Meal. The Happy Meal was invented in 1979, and sometime after that, the evangelicals decided that fetuses are persons from the moment of conception. So in 1979, the Christian magazine Christianity Today did an issue on abortion and contraception. And what is written here is at the bottom. I don't know. Whoops. Where are we now? That's where we want to be here. So this says, God does not regard the fetus as a soul, no matter how far gestation has progressed. The law plainly exacts if man kill any human life, he'll be put to death. But according to Exodus chapter 21, the destruction of the fetus is not a capital offense. You're not put to death. So clearly then, in contrast to the mother, the fetus is not reckoned as a soul. That was the understanding of the evangelical church in 1979. But it changed a little bit later. And as, according to people who study this, it was due to a court decision, but not Roe versus Wade. It was Brown versus Board of Education. So Brown versus Board of Education, of course, required schools to not be segregated. Yeah, so schools had to admit white people and black people as well. And so desegregation started in earnest in 1969. And as it says here, in 1969, the first year of desegregation, the number of white students enrolled in public schools in Holmes County, Mississippi, dropped from 771 to 28. In the following year, that number fell to 0. And so what happened, they created a number of segregation academies that had only white people in them. But they wanted these academies to be tax exempt. But as a result of the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, they couldn't be considered tax exempt unless they admitted black students, and they didn't want to do this. So they were sued by some of the people in Holmes County there in the Green versus Kennedy case. This went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ultimately lost in an 8-1 decision. Said, nope, unless you start admitting black people, you're not going to be given tax-exempt status. And so Jerry Falwell wanted to know, how do we rally the base so that we can get political decisions made in accordance with our wishes? And what he found is that racial desegregation was not something that actually got their blood going, but the abortion controversy was. And so, as Randall Ballmer writes in The Real Origins of the Religious Right, it turns out that the movement can be traced its political roots back to a court ruling, but not Roe versus Wade. Falwell and Ryrick were savvy enough to recognize that organizing grassroots evangelicals to defend racial discrimination would be a challenge. So although abortion had emerged as a rallying cry in 1980, the real roots of the religious right lie not in the defense of the fetus, but in the defense of racial segregation. So that's a short little history of what was going on here. Well, we've seen that from a philosophical point of view, we can't consider the fetus to be a person. From a scientific point of view, we can't consider the fetus to be a person. From a biblical point of view, we can't consider the fetus to be a person. So it looks like abortions cannot be considered to be murder. So when the experts are agreed, I think we should follow Bertrand Russell's advice here and recognize that it's folly to believe otherwise. Well, that's all I have.
Thank you, Ted, and we'll open up for any questions. If you do have a question, I will hand the mic to you, so please, for the recording, so that it'll be heard by that. Anyone? Oh, come on, we can't all be. Well, I guess that's it. Oh, okay. Joyce?
Given everything that you've said, why do you think we have such a vehement and fairly sizable portion of the population that is absolutely unable and unwilling to recognize one single thing that you just talked about up there, and without exception? I mean, why? What is it? It was always illegal in my youth and so forth until Roe versus Wade. And even after that, it wasn't all that easy to get an abortion. Even with Roe, it was banned by Medicaid. You had to pay for it. It was a lot of money for a young, I mean, it was never really able to be part of the norm or the normal healthcare system or any woman's autonomy. There was always big issues about it. And it's just latched on now to a political movement and so forth, I think. But what is it? What is it? People die all over the world. No one cares. No one cares. If people die in wars or they drown in the Mediterranean, nobody cares anything about all these people. So I don't understand the vehemence of that side.
Right. Well, so you've asked a sociological question, and us philosophers are not, we can't answer those sorts of things. But I think it's because so much false information is out there. I mean, people think that souls are in the Bible. I mean, you tell them that the notion of a soul is unbiblical. Yeah, right. Well, I think it's because people believe that these views are in the Bible, and they think that because it's in the Bible, it's something that, has to be followed. I think that's the problem.
A big source of it is Catholicism. So how do you explain the Catholics' view on abortion?
Right. Well, so the Catholics' view of abortion, so the Catholics actually did not think that the fetus was a person from the moment of conception until 1869. Pope Pius IX held that. But St. Thomas Aquinas, I think maybe I have some other slides here. So here's St. Augustine. He says, now who is there that is not rather disposed to think that unformed abortions perish like seeds that have never fructified? He didn't think that abortion was particularly wrong. St. Thomas Aquinas said there can't be a fully human soul unless a fully human body. That is a body that can reason. So these two great theologians of the Catholic Church did not think that it was even possible for the fetus to be a person from the moment of conception. But Pope Pius IX came along in 1869 and said, nope, a fetus is a person from the moment of conception. And I don't know what his reason for that was. But, he's an interesting character. So he came up with the notion that the soul is infused at the moment of conception. He also is the guy who came up with the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception.
Really?
And so, since 1869. It's not before 1869. And the Immaculate Conception has nothing to do with Jesus' conception.
Really?
So you know what it's about. What's the Immaculate Conception about?
Sinless.
I'm a terrible.
Pardon?
Sinless.
Right.
Mary.
It's Mary's conception. So the idea was that sin is passed down through the mother, just like Jewishness is passed down through the mother, right? So if you're the, if you're the son or daughter of a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish man, you're considered to be Jewish. But if you're the son or daughter of a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman, you're not Jewish. You have to be converted, right? So sin is passed down through the mother. So this was a problem. How do we, not allow Jesus to be born with sin? You would think that the theologians could have said, well, Jesus was special. But instead, they decided to push it back once. So Jesus was born without sin because Mary was born without sin. That was the Immaculate Conception, was Mary. So this is Pope Pius IX. He gave us the soul is infused at the moment of conception. He gave us Immaculate Conception. And you know what else he gave us? Papal infallibility. Oh, and by the way, I'm infallible. So don't even bother questioning me. The doctrine of papal infallibility didn't exist before that time. So that's a short history of that sort of thing.
All right, so I wanted to maybe take this in a little bit different direction. And first of all, thank you for this great talk about everything. I think it's been very helpful. But I want to go to that 7-month point where there are some that say, okay, but at this point, brain activity starts, and it starts to suggest that at 7 months you are a person, but you're not independent. And so if you
Right.
could talk about a little bit of your thoughts or your understanding of where does the independence versus dependent, because you're not like a separate functioning human
Right.
being, even if you are thinking.
Right. So, so you're not a separate, independent being. You have some degree of consciousness, But you're not actually a full-blown person at that time either, because you don't have self-consciousness, you can't reason, you can't really communicate, can't really engage in self-motivated activity and that sort of stuff. Up to that point, you're not a person, but when something is conscious, you have to take into account the fact that it can feel pain, for example, right? So you don't want to inflict pain except for good reason. So, but, if a woman is a person and the fetus is not a person, and she's not going to be able to support this baby, then, she has a good reason to get an abortion.
Ted, not that you need any more ammunition, but I remember in the Bible the story of the bitter water, ordeal of the bitter water.
Right.
Where God gives Moses instructions on how to give an abortion to a pregnant woman who's suspected of infidelity.
Right. So they actually do give a recipe for an abortifacient in the Bible. That's right.
I saw a slide potentiality.
Okay, you want to take a look at that?
Yeah.
So, I thought that question might come up, so let's take a look at that. So, some people say, well, okay, so a fetus is not a person, but a fetus is a potential person, right? But a potential person only has potential rights. It doesn't have any actual rights. The rights will become actual when it becomes actual, right? So I imagine that most of you here are potential presidents of the United States, right? But that doesn't mean you get Secret Service protection now, right? So as Peter Singer says, there's no rule that says that a potential X has the same value as an actual X or has all the rights of an actual X. There are many examples that show just the contrary. Pulling out a sprouting acorn is not the same as cutting down a venerable oak. To drop a live chicken into a pot of boiling water would be much worse than doing the same to an egg. Prince Charles is the potential king of England, and of course now he's the king of England, but he does not now have the rights of a king. Now he does, because he's become the actual king. So potential people have potential rights, but they don't become actual till they become actual.
That seems not quite fair. Potential in being a human being. Drop the rights part. Just the potential. A chicken egg isn't going to be a human being, but a fetus will be a human being. So,
Right.
from that context, do you have any comment? Thank you.
Right. Well, so then the question is, is the mother obligated to bring that being into existence, even if it causes her great hardship and pain?
Well, that's another argument.
Yeah, right. But that's so the mother's right not to be forced to suffer. She's an actual person, right?
Agreed.
And the fetus is not an actual person. So whatever rights it has is going to be overridden by the rights of the mother.
I actually have 3 questions. First, this is, I think this is so beautiful, all the logic. I kind of really think, wow, no, it's amazing. Do we get a recording? Because I tried to repeat some little part of it. I couldn't remember everything you said. Do we have access?
YouTube channel.
Oh, YouTube channel. Thank you. Yeah. So that's the easy one. My second question is how long did you study this? This is just so amazing. Yeah.
Oh, well, so I teach biomedical ethics at Muhlenberg, or I taught my biomedical ethics. So I taught this every semester for many
did.
semesters.
Okay. Got it. Yeah. So my third question is that I kind of think that it's okay with Buddhism as well, but did you have any comment on how the soul part or, with the Buddhism?
Yeah.
So what do the Buddhists think
On
about
the
this?
soul side, right? With the soul.
Well, the Buddhists don't believe in the existence of the soul. And that's really the fundamental teaching of Buddhism. So the fundamental teaching is anicca and anatta. There's no permanent substance and there's no permanent soul, right? So the Buddhists say that it's the belief in a continuing soul that's the source of all the pain and suffering and misery in the world. It's I, me, mine, I need, I want, I must have. That's what creates all the wars and all the conflict between people. And so what Buddhism tries to teach you is that the soul is an illusion. And that's the purpose of Buddhist meditation, is to realize that there is no such thing as a soul.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned some things. You title your talk, "Abortion is not a moral issue."
Well, it's not strictly speaking, it's not a moral disagreement because the people on the two sides of the issue don't hold differing theories of morality.
Right.
Yeah.
But you also said it's a metaphysical issue.
Right.
My view is abortion is a political issue.
Right. Well, it's that too.
And, I think you did a good job of surveying the evolution of that issue. Many Republicans years ago had nothing, supported abortion rights, and then it changed and I just see it as anything that can gain political leverage becomes an issue. And so, I think it was Groucho Marx who said, anything you're for, I'm against. and I think that's what this senator from Alabama has been holding up all of these promotions in the Department of Defense over an abortion issue. If you ask him, I guess he would say it's a moral issue, but it's a political issue now, and is depriving our own country from carrying out a fundamental responsibility.
Right. Well, it certainly is a political issue. I wish it was a political issue that was more informed by the facts. I mean, I wish people knew the facts. Maybe they'd change their mind on this issue, but the facts are difficult to get out there.
I just wanted to ask, going back to the 7-month thing, talking about pain, I was wondering, is there a general consensus of when roughly that personhood would start? Because I think going off of the 5, I think most people would agree that even a newborn baby wouldn't yet have all 5 of those.
Right. And so a newborn baby doesn't have all 5, so technically speaking, it's not a person. But the people who believe that even a newborn infant is not technically speaking a person think that newborn infants should be protected by the death penalty. Right? So although it's not fully speaking a person, it's a valuable form of human life. And it's a valuable form of human life that people value and don't want to see destroyed. There's nothing contradictory about saying that. So you may know the penalty for stealing another man's horse in the Wild West days. You know what the penalty was? It was death, right? And that's not because they thought horses were persons or something. It was just horses were valuable, right? So we can recognize that, newborn infants are valuable, and we should protect them with the strongest penalties possible, namely make it a capital crime for killing a newborn infant, still recognizing that they're not full-blown persons according to the definition of persons. So birth makes a difference. So as Marianne Warren puts it, a woman can demand freedom from the fetus, but she can't demand the death of the fetus.
Coming around, we have a question in the top row. Just trying to make it closer.
I would think that in the same way that
Just speak more into the mic.
I would think that in the same way that any one individual can't be forced to give their organs to somebody else who is in need of an organ, say of the same blood type. A pregnant woman can't be forced to stay pregnant through the entire pregnancy just because she got pregnant.
Right.
And the thing about, say, a fetus, it's about the potential, I think, more than what you were saying about a newborn versus, say, somebody with brain death. That even though it's a similar situation, they're both, say, a person, somebody who's brain deaf, they obviously have no potential. But a newborn who's just been born to somebody who obviously wanted a baby, they have much more potential. It's a completely different situation.
And there's a famous court case that happened in Pennsylvania here, McFall versus Schick. And I think this was, I think it was out in the Pittsburgh area or something like that, but there was a guy that needed some bone marrow. He needed a bone marrow transplant because he had cancer of the bone marrow. And so, they did a nationwide search, and it turned out that the only person that had compatible bone marrow, I think, was his cousin. And so asked his cousin, could you loan me some of your bone marrow because I'm going to die without it? And he says, no, it's my bone marrow. I'm sorry, I'm gonna keep it for myself. And so he sued his cousin, and went to court in Pennsylvania, and the court decided, no, it's his body. You can't force him to give up, something in his body if he doesn't want to give it up. And that would be the same even if it was his mother. If his mother was the only person that was a donor. Even the mother couldn't have been forced to give up her bone marrow against her will. So that's right. Your body is yours to do with what you want, and nobody should be able to force you to do something you don't want to do with it.
You had mentioned that you had taught biomedical ethics, and I'm curious as to whether or not you've come across cases of post-birth abortions or child euthanasia.
No, I mean, child euthanasia would be, there are cultures in which that's practiced. So, for example, there's a tribe in New Guinea. If, it's too difficult, if there's not enough food around for the people in the tribe to stay alive and somebody gives birth, then they might perform a post-birth abortion. But I don't think that otherwise, with extenuating circumstances like that there is such a thing. Although another interesting sort of case would be, for example, a baby that's born anencephalic. So if you're born anencephalic, you don't have a brain. And so oftentimes babies who are born anencephalic may have viable organs that could be used for other babies that have some other deficiency of one sort or another. And so this has happened from time to time when people have identified a baby, an anencephalic baby, whose organs could be used for another baby who was already born. But the rule is now that you can't take the organs out of the anencephalic baby until the baby dies. So you have to withhold water and food from the anencephalic baby until it dies. And of course, once you do that, then the organs are no good. I mean, so this is another place where it doesn't seem to make much sense. I mean, so I'm sure that the people who had the anencephalic baby would like something good to come from this pregnancy, and here is something that could come from it, could give life to another baby. But given our laws, that's not an option now.
Any other questions?
Thank you for this. As an educator and a philosopher who relies on facts, how do you educate people who believe in alternate facts?
Well, you just try to present them with their real facts and hope that they understand what's real. I did write a book about that. It's called How to Think About Weird Things, currently in its 9th edition. So, and it's all about how to distinguish real facts from fake facts and legitimate claims from illegitimate claims. And so if you're interested, you can pick up any number of used copies, I'm sure.
Anyone else? All right, well, great. Well, thank you very much, Ted. It was a wonderful speech. And I know usually after